Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this episode, we will examine the question, what is symbolic extermination? All right, so we can get through this relatively quickly, I believe. And in order to do so, I've put together 8 steps. And the 8 steps are the argument, or what is symbolic extermination? The successive stages of self-image, the illusion of limitlessness. Why symbolic? Does it depend on theism? Does this idea of symbolic extermination depend on theism? Some comments about inauthentic death, the final solution, and its relation to the Socratic wisdom schools. All right. So, an authentic meaning of life is determined by its limits, its terminal points, the points where it is terminated. Instead of living life based on an understanding of the real self, life is lived in relation to a virtual self that virtually has no limits. This could be understood as an ideological state apparatus for the sake of reproducing the conditions of production. Althusser. For example, turning citizens into the best consumers possible, the representation of the real self is replaced by a hyperreal self, which virtually has no limits. So by having no limits, it's just going to continue to consume, right? By being able to sell you products to live longer, then you can live longer so that you can continue to consume products. It is interminable. Its capacity to consume, to purchase and please itself, virtually has no limits, this postmodern self, this hyperreal self. Thus, the real self is exterminated by being exterminated. The virtual removal of the limits of the real self exterminates the real self, since it is its limits that constitute the self as real. All right, so those are the 6 steps in this presentation toward understanding what Jean Baudrillard meant by symbolic extermination. And I talked about the successive stages of self-image from simulacra and simulation in other videos, but I think it's so important that it's worth mentioning again here. So briefly, we could say that the self-image is a representation of reality if we are considering reality and the self in an absolute way. The self-image masks and denatures the truth of reality when we are considering reality and the self in a relative way. So for example, in the absolute way, it's just the easiest way. This is also why later I ask, does it depend on theism? But the easiest way to understand an absolute relation is by invoking God. So you could say something like, reality is absolute by virtue of unity with God. So if that's the absolute, then of course the nihilistic would be the absence of any kind of unity, the absence of God. So let's keep going through these 4 phases. So the third phase then is more relativistic than the second. And here we see that the self-image masks the absence of a profound reality. There is no difference in value between the godly image and the worldly image, right? So in the first phase, which is absolute, you have the image of yourself that is real, is the image of yourself that God has. In the first phase of the relativistic stage, it is possible for the worldly self to mask the real self. So it's possible for you to start to think of yourself in terms of the worldly self and to lose sight of your real self, or to lose sight of yourself as God sees you. So as we move into the second phase then of this relativistic stage, we can see that the self-image masks the absence of a profound reality. So the idea here is that there really is no difference between the godly image of yourself and the worldly image of yourself, because really they're just purely relative images of the self. And then lastly, the self-image in the nihilistic stage, the self-image has no relation to any reality whatsoever. So it is a sign without a real reference. It is its own pure simulacrum. This is all self-images are meaningless. This is, of course, nihilistic. So according to Jean Baudrillard, the illusion of limitlessness, and the idea here is that limitlessness is an illusion because we die. So it's fascinating to me that though Jean Baudrillard is not really considered an existentialist, he's not really working on existential ideas, there is some sense in which there is a thread of existentialism running through Jean Baudrillard. I'm working out this idea now of how it is possible to identify Jean Baudrillard as an existentialist. But so basically this idea of death, right? The inescapability of death, inevitability of death, you can't escape it. So because we will die, the idea that we will not die is an illusion. So the illusion of limitlessness primes us, according to Jean Baudrillard, for nihilism. By desiring limitlessness and in the pursuit of limitlessness, we make meaning regarding life experiences without regard to our actual existence. Heidegger would call this an inauthentic relation to death. Baudrillard plays with the word termination to suggest that this removing of terminal points is doubly a kind of extermination. On the one hand, it is an extermination in that we no longer dwell within our limits. And on the other hand, this no longer dwelling within our limits effectively exterminates us by separating us from what we truly are. You can hear that undertone definition of authenticity, this being separated from what you truly are, a limited being. Okay, so why symbolic, right? Jean Baudrillard calls this symbolic extermination. Just like Trompe-l'oeil art, the statistical view of life invokes an illusory worldview. There's something shocking about that statement. Illusory, not because statistics are wrong, though sometimes they are wrong, but rather because the shift into a statistical worldview separates us from our authentic engagement with being. That means something like we are living based on a symbolic meaning rather than on a human meaning. So, at what point does technological mediation make a worldview cybernetic rather than human? The worldview in which everyone in the world is equal and the worldview of an ethnically cleansed, eugenics-based world are the same in that they are both cybernetic worldviews. So, does the truth of symbolic extermination depend on theism? I think that this is a legitimate question, and I think that many people will want to ask this question because if it does, then they don't want to have anything to do with it, right? But it's a little more nuanced than that. So, becoming nothing more than a material instance or instantiation of the circulation of capital, right? That is a kind of symbolic extermination. And if you think about that, it lines up perfectly with this idea of people being grown in the matrix. Thus, symbolic extermination does not depend on theism. We can see this from the other direction. We can say that the circulation of capital, or the machine and technological mediation, if you want to put it that way, that it has pushed us into a nihilistic relation. So we don't have to start, for example, from some sort of godly image of ourselves and then trace its degeneration, we can just locate ourselves in a degenerated postmodern situation, a degenerated postmodern state. So symbolic extermination then does not depend on theism. An array of characterizations of reality could work. For example, harmony with nature, even if it is atheistic, would validate symbolic extermination as an accurate depiction of postmodernity. So you could say something like what I was calling a few slides ago, the godly image of yourself, could be something like the in harmony with nature image of yourself. Symbolic extermination via inauthentic life, and inauthentic life via inauthentic death. So here we have these ideas of the double, the perfect crime, and the final solution. And these are all ways that Baudrillard characterized symbolic extermination. So in general, each of these characterizations is grounded in the difference between an authentic and an inauthentic death, and the existential truth that authentic death is the ground of authentic living. So therefore, again, right, this extermination is by way of removing, we're just working the slide backwards, right? By way of removing the death, we end up removing the life. This is why in existentialism we say that you want to own your death, right? That this is the death that you have chosen based on the life that you have chosen. We looked at these slides in the Hyperreality presentation, but these slides are so important and relevant for symbolic extermination that I've included them here. This was the fourth way of understanding hyperreality. So according to Baudrillard, I'm quoting him, two quotes here. The first one, he says, "Let us be clear. If the real is disappearing, it is not because of a lack of it. On the contrary, there is too much of it. It is the excess of reality that puts an end to reality. Just as the excess of information puts an end to information, or the excess of communication puts an end to communication." And I think you could go so far as to say something like the excess of communication puts an end to authentic communication. So you can see the underlying existentialism here. The last quote, "We are no longer in a logic of the passage from the virtual to actual, but in a hyperrealist logic of the deterrence of the real by the virtual." So if you want to look at what is meant by hyperrealist logic there, check out the presentation on what is hyperreality. But the idea in regard to symbolic extermination is that by regulating our behaviors by way of a hyperreal self-image, or by, we could say, making choices in regard to a hyperreal self-image, that there is some sense then in which we are deterred from, distracted from our authentic engagement with reality, our authentic engagement with actuality. And so this is what Baudrillard refers to as the hyperrealist logic, and that hyperrealist logic is underneath and working inside of symbolic extermination. Okay, again, this comes from the Hyperreality presentation, but quickly, I think it's deeply relevant here and worth quoting again. "This is also known as the technoscientific regulation of human life." So it's a kind of technological mediation, a kind of, and by technological mediation, we also mean chemical mediation, transhumanism. Transhumanism on the way to posthumanism. So we take the map, the technoscientific image of a human, to be what the territory, the human, actually is. This becomes full-on posthumanism, full-on simulation, full-on postmodernism, when we take the map as the only reality, the only hyperreal reality, by suggesting that the old image of a human was just superstitious ignorance. So all of this is consistent with the other presentations. The desert of the real, of course, comes from Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. And it's highly relevant for this idea of symbolic extermination. So I want to quote this passage to you. Simulation is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. The territory does not survive the map. The map engenders the territory. Today, it is the territory whose shreds slowly rot across the extent of the map. It is the real and not the map, whose vestiges persist here and there in the deserts that are no longer those of the empire, but ours, the desert of the real. I like this way of referring to what Baudrillard is talking about, and I think that this really does help make sense of everything we've said thus far. So we have recycling at every level. So, quote, we are in the third order, which is the order no longer of the real, but of the hyperreal. It is only here that theories and practices, themselves floating and indeterminate, can reach the real and beat it to death. Symbolic extermination. Everything that filters into the non-finality of the space-time of the code, here we get this idea of the matrix, or that attempts to intervene in it, is disconnected from its own ends, disintegrated and absorbed, recycling at every level. Symbolic extermination. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple more slides here to finish this off. So symbolic extermination and social worldviews. So notice that from this absolute point of view, we could say that ethnocentrism is a kind of absolute point of view, and that notice that it has limits, right? So ethnocentrism is defined by its limits. That's the absolute stage. As we enter into the relative stage, we see cultural relativism. And cultural relativism is less limited than ethnocentrism, right? And as we move from this relative stage to the nihilistic stage, and notice that utopian multiculturalism is unlimited, right? It could be the collection or celebration of innumerable cultures. And of course, consistent with the logic, the philosophical logic of everything that we've been talking about here, this is nihilistic. In other words, according to Baudrillard, it is a kind of symbolic extermination. This idea that one is unlimited, this refusal to acknowledge one's limits, is a kind of extermination. So this just jumped out at me, and I thought this is something worth pursuing. Let's discuss this to help add depth to everything that we've looked at so far. So the Epicurus, of course, the Epicurean characterization of vain and empty desire refers to a kind of soteriological extermination. Thus, it is helpful to juxtapose the extermination brought about by the postmodern self-image with the extermination discussed by Epicurus. So, Epicurus distinguished between three types of desires. 1, natural and necessary desires. 2, natural but unnecessary desires. And 3, vain and empty desires. Okay, so first, natural and necessary desires include desires for things such as food and shelter, right? They are necessary because you cannot survive without them. Epicurus thinks that these desires are easy to satisfy, difficult to eliminate, and bring great pleasure when satisfied. They are necessary for life, and they are naturally limited. If you are hungry, your desire can be satisfied by a limited amount of food. Second, a natural but non-necessary desire is the desire for luxurious food or luxurious shelter. Also, sex is considered non-necessary since not having it won't kill you. I know some people probably disagree with that. Lastly then, vain desires. Third, vain desires. Vain desires include desires for power, wealth, fame, and those types of things, and so on. These are more difficult to satisfy precisely because they do not seem to have a natural limit. Also, these desires are considered non-natural since they tend to arise due to interaction with others and not naturally, that is, on their own. This is according to Epicurus. Notice how the idea of natural limit may refer to a kind of natural justice. That is to say, we can only eat so much food before we become sick. We can only engage in so many sex acts before we become exhausted and in pain. However, the desire for likes on social media is limitless. Thus, analogously, the postmodern self-image functions like a non-natural vain desire. So I hope we now have a better grip on Jean Baudrillard's idea of symbolic extermination. This, of course, relates to many of the other presentations that I have put together for you, especially what is postmodernism, what is nihilism, what is hyperreality, and humanism, transhumanism, posthumanism, function, narration, simulation. So hopefully it's the case that the big picture really is lighting up for us now. And I appreciate you being here. Thank you.